The legendary Boeing B-29 Superfortress flies into War Thunder with an astounding bomb load and amazing high-altitude performance. Let's check it out. The B-29 was one of the largest, most complex, and expensive engineering projects of the entire Second World War. It cost more than the Manhattan Project to develop and produce, but when it finally took to the air, it was many years ahead of its time, both in performance and technology. Work started in 1939 with a U.S. Army Air Corps request for a super bomber that could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs over 2,500 miles at airspeeds approaching 400 miles an hour. These were absurdly high performance goals for the time, but it did succeed in triggering some pretty serious innovations. Several designs were considered, but the choice was made to proceed with the Model 345 from Boeing, and work began in earnest. The Superfortress featured a pressurized cabin, remotely controlled gun turrets, state-of-the-art radio and navigation systems, and a highly advanced bomb sight. Not to mention, absolutely unprecedented performance that made every other bomber on the planet completely obsolete when it flew for the first time in 1942. While serving in World War II, the B-29 was used in heavy bombing raids against Japan, and with its high-altitude performance, very few Japanese planes could even try to intercept it. The B-29 was also famously used to deliver the only two nuclear weapons ever used in combat, which ended the Second World War out in the Pacific. After the war, the B-29 served well into the 1950s in its role as a strategic bomber, but when the Korean War broke out, it was found to be quite vulnerable to the new generation of jet fighters that were entering service. The plane was copied by the Soviet Union as the Tu-4 and led to many advanced versions both in the USA and the USSR. The original models were eventually replaced by the B-47 and B-36, but tankers and utility versions served the U.S. Air Force well into the 1960s. What we get in War Thunder is the B-29A BN, which is a designation that indicates the model and where it was produced. This is a conventional bomber in the game, and it sits in Rank 4 of the U.S. Air Tree at Battle Rating 7.3. The B-29 can carry upwards of 20,000 pounds of conventional dumb bombs, with a couple of different loadout options, including bomb sizes of 500, 1,000, and 2,000 pounds. It also has a total of 5 defensive gun turrets, which provides a full field of fire with no significant blind spots, and it's got more turret ammo than you'll ever need. Now, being a World War II prop bomber, the B-29 gets a bomb sight view, but no advanced targeting systems beyond that. The flight performance of the B-29 offers excellent high-altitude capabilities, but this comes at a cost. All of the performance shortcomings of prop bombers are amplified here, big time. The plane has reasonable climb performance, and it's pretty fast for a traditional piston engine bomber. However, it's enormous, lumbers in the air, and it can be quite difficult to fly if you're doing anything but simplistic level bombing. The plane has combat flaps that can drop at around 300 kilometers an hour and a wing rip speed of about 600. That actually ends up being really important, since you spend most of your time flying this thing up at high altitude. At least you probably will. And when it's time to come down, it can actually be a little delicate to get this thing down quickly without building up too much airspeed. The turn performance is awful, which it should be, and if you find yourself trying to make small adjustments, for example when you're lining up bomb drops, it's really easy for this plane to find itself in this weird cycle of horizontal overcorrections back and forth. The plane has a max ceiling altitude of over 10,000 meters, but Realistically, in War Thunder's game modes, you're never going up that high. Now, taking the B-29 out into battle is basically the epitome of heavy prop bomber gameplay. Being War Thunder, there are a lot of ways you can play this thing, but let's keep it real for a minute. If you want to actually be successful in the B-29, your game is going to be high-altitude level bombing on strategic bases. You can do other stuff, and we're going to talk about it, but it's significantly higher risk, usually has lower rewards, and frankly, it takes quite a bit of luck. Now, with that said, this is Tim's Variety, so let's take a little bit of a look at how you can use this thing in different roles. If you do the normal strategic bomber meta, altitude is your friend. If you think you've got enough altitude, you don't, get some more. In arcade battles, if you get enough altitude, the B-29 can win a match all by itself by taking out all 4 bases in just 1 or 2 passes, and then running circles over the enemy airfield up at 7,000 meters or higher. In realistic battles, the bomb load will usually be enough to take out 3 or 4 bases if nobody else steals them from you, which is going to happen pretty often, since this plane is pretty slow compared to some of the lower-tiered strike jets it gets paired with. The catch with high-altitude bombing is that it takes quite a long time for your bombs to hit when you drop them from way up high. This makes it really pretty impractical to try and take out ground units like tanks or something, since they're moving around. If you do the high-altitude bombing thing, just stick to the bases regardless of your game mode. Now, if you want to focus on AI ground units instead of bases, you kind of need to fly a lot lower to get more accurate bomb drops. And lower altitude means higher risk. Way higher. At the battle rating the B-29 flies at, you're often going to be up against stuff like Me-262s, MiG-9s, R2-Y2s, Meteors, and so on. That is, jet fighters with big chonky cannons that are hungry for some slow-moving bomber. Now, the B-29, remember, is a high-altitude strategic bomber, but if you must fly it out as close air support, you've got some challenges to consider. If you try and do high-altitude bombing, it's going to take quite a long time for your bombs to land, and player vehicles are probably going to dive out of the way, presuming you can even spot things to drop on. The other serious problem is the strong possibility of friendly fire kills if you try to do carpet bombing tactics or that sort of thing. The most effective way I've found is to do low-level runs over the battlefield, but you have to line the runs up carefully, since you can't really make minor adjustments to your bomb drops very easily. Overall, the B-29 is very difficult to use as close air support, and its wings are incredibly vulnerable to enemy fire, even just basic machine guns from the ground. And blowing up friendly targets is a serious risk with these huge bombs, so be careful. Now, in terms of its defensive armaments, okay, so all the footage in this review is done with an expert or ace crew. That said, in my experience, the AI-controlled gunners kind of suck at their jobs in this plane, and they don't hit very often, especially against fast-moving jets. And, combined with the low firepower of the 50 cals, means that, just me personally, I have better success trying to use the manual control on the gun turrets, and I'm not even very good at it. So, it's something to think about. Visually, I think the B-29 is a beautiful aircraft. Despite being a prop bomber from the 1940s, its fuselage shape can't help but still look kinda modern, and that glazed nose is just awesome. Plus, it's a great opportunity to decorate your plane with some fun nose art. Now, landing the B-29... Alright, this is actually pretty hard. One of the main challenges is that before landing, you've got to lose a few thousand meters of altitude in a big heavy bomber that wing rips at about 600 kilometers an hour and doesn't have air brakes. You just cut the throttle and get yourself into a shallow dive all the way back to your base. You should start this descent immediately after finishing your bomb run, because this thing is lumbery and it doesn't turn well, especially with a cut throttle, you gotta try and position yourself so that you've got a good 5 to 10 kilometer long final approach below 1,000 meters. Now, you can drop gear at a bit over 300 kilometers an hour and flaps at around 250, but honestly, I find landing this thing with the flaps to be a lot more difficult, and it makes the plane a bit more floaty in ground effect. Really, if you're going to be serious about using the B-29 in non-arcade game modes, go practice the landing a few dozen times in test flights. Given the huge repair bill, it's worth the time to get good at it. The cockpit, it's a placeholder with very poor visibility. Accurate bombing from the cockpit is impossible, and overall, it's pretty weak. To close out on the B-29 Superfortress. This thing has an enormous payload of bombs, and it can win matches all by itself. It has no real blind spots with the gun turrets. It does pretty well at high altitude, and it's fast for a prop bomber. However, coming down from high altitude is a chore in War Thunder's game modes. Its wings are incredibly vulnerable to enemy fire. It's difficult to land, it's still got a really high repair cost, and it's an enormous target that flies like an oil tanker. The final verdict on the B-29A BN is that this, along with the Tu-4, is likely to be the end of the line for strategic bombing in War Thunder until they make some pretty dramatic changes to the current game modes. So, if you're into heavy bomber gameplay, this is just about as good as it's gonna get. As always, thanks for watching.